In this episode of the Rescue Mission podcast, we are focusing on a new series covering the 5 waves of the rescue mission and city mission movement.
That's right. It's a big topic.
It is. And in this episode, the focus is the first wave called city mission societies.
Now, while many people are familiar with city missions and rescue missions today, they're often not familiar with these earlier city mission societies and the innovations that really form the foundation for the whole movement.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission today, in this deep dive, is to really get under the hood and uncover the foundational blueprint of modern urban ministry. We're immersing ourselves in the world of the original city mission society.
Yeah.
And the sources you provided, they really define this era, we're talking late 18th, early 19th centuries, as, well, essential, groundbreaking even.
Definitely.
Primarily because they innovated the structure of charity, didn't they? The whole way people mobilized. It feels like a fundamental shift in how poverty was even approached.
It absolutely was. And what's truly fascinating here is how these societies, which, came right out of this intense period of spiritual revival, they effectively engineered the first comprehensive church-funded social safety net.
Church-funded, yeah, not government.
No, not yet. They looked at these exploding problems in the industrializing cities. I mean, the sheer scale of poverty, the spiritual emptiness, this growing sense of urban, godlessness.
Right.
And they realized that the existing structures, the established church, they were just utterly inadequate, couldn't cope.
So the challenge wasn't just, let's help out a bit.
No. It was much bigger. It was, how do we build a system that can actually handle the scope of this new urban reality?
And that structural response, that's the key insight we really need to hold on to, isn't it? They saw the old charity models weren't working, maybe even failing systemically. And they knew they needed to construct something new, something robust, strategic to counter it. So let's start right at the beginning. The theological, the social furnace that forged this whole movement, late 18th, early 19th centuries. What was the spiritual climate actually like leading up to these societies forming?
Well, the landscape, socially and religiously, had been pretty profoundly shaken up by the Enlightenment. Secular rationalism was really gaining ground.
Okay.
And by the mid-18th century, this often meant that established faith felt, the sources say, formal, stale, and impersonal.
Just going through the motions, maybe?
Kind of. The official church, whether it was Anglican in Britain or various denominations in America, it was often too slow, maybe too rigid, or just geographically cut off from where people were really struggling, these burgeoning slum populations. It couldn't effectively engage.
Really a disconnect.
A big disconnect. The sources paint this picture of huge material need right alongside this kind of vast spiritual apathy.
Okay, so if the spiritual air was, let's say, heavy, maybe inert, what was the spark? What provided the essential catalyst for this huge mobilization?
That catalyst was the intense religious fervor of the First and especially the Second Great Awakening. These weren't small things.
Well,
they swept through Britain and America. These were massive spiritual revivals that fundamentally recharged personal religious feeling, piety, and generated this powerful, immediate missionary passion.
Right.
It was, in effect, a huge spiritual mobilization, driven by this urgent belief that the world, both, overseas and right here at home, needed saving now.
And this spiritual revival, it had direct, practical, organizational consequences. It wasn't just about feelings.
No, absolutely not.
It demanded action.
Yeah.
And that meant rethinking some theology, too. I see a reference here that this passion directly challenged a prevailing theological stance specifically, a kind of rigid Calvinism that sometimes fostered passivity. Can you unpack that theological pivot for us?
Yeah, that's crucial. The distinction is really important. If someone operates under the belief that, salvation, conversion, it's all entirely predetermined by God's will, well, there might be a tendency to just wait.
Quietism, right?
Exactly, quietism, or waiting for God to act solely through some supernatural sign. But the revivalist spirit, it radically shifted that perspective. It hammered home human responsibility, human agency. It demanded that believers actively use means.
Like tools, strategies.
Yes, intentional strategies, organized effort, structured societies, using these means for the conversion of the world.
So they felt called to actively cooperate with God's plan through organization.
Precisely. The sources point to figures like Greville Ewing, who was just consumed by this zeal, laboring tirelessly, traveling constantly, utterly convinced that their organized efforts wouldn't be wasted. Why? Because they served a gracious master who expected them to act. And this commitment to means it immediately looked for a structured outlet. You've got this newly accessible world thanks to industrialization, global trade, creating this urgent need for a structured vehicle to carry the gospel.
A vehicle.
Globally, that vehicle became the foreign missionary societies. Domestically, on these chaotic city streets, it became the city mission societies.
And that necessity, that brings us right to the core structural innovation, the society model itself. The sources really hammer this home. The society as the key invention that let this new spiritual energy become a strategic, sustainable movement.
It really was an act of profound entrepreneurial genius, but applied to charity. The core innovation wasn't, a new kind of soup kitchen or a building. It was setting up a strategic, non-denominational coordinating body.
Non-denominational. That's interesting.
Crucially, it wasn't just one church deciding, okay, let's help our neighborhood. This was a coalition. You had concerned pastors, civic leaders, lay leaders, all coming together specifically to look at the needs of the entire city region.
Wow.
Transcending those little parochial boundaries and, importantly, denominational divides.
That kind of collaboration across those lines, that must have been pretty revolutionary at the time. So what was the explicit job, the function of this new society?
Its purpose was purely strategic, macro level. The society's job was, first, survey the vast, often chaotic needs of the city, then synthesize that information, create a unified Protestant response, that coordination piece again.
Okay.
Then raise dedicated funds at scale, and then, most importantly, found and incubate new specialized ministries to fill the gaps they'd identified.
So they were like the planners, the funders.
Exactly. It functioned, as one source puts it, as the strategic headquarters for the church's war on urban poverty and godlessness.
A war room, almost.
Kind of. It meant they weren't just providing immediate relief. They were planning a long-term, multi-front campaign against what they saw as systemic, spiritual, and material destitution.
This strategic layer, this is, I can see how that gets missed when we look back.
Yeah.
It sounds much more complex than just charity. And here's where it gets, for me, really interesting. Because the language society versus mission, it can sound a bit redundant to us now, maybe. But that distinction is the whole point of their structural innovation, isn't it?
Yeah.
Why is it so vital to distinguish the big society from the local mission?
Oh, it's absolutely vital if we want to grasp the sheer scale and ambition of this first wave. It's a difference in organizational scale, yes, but also strategic intent.
Okay.
The sources argue pretty strongly, actually, that understanding the separation is the key to recovering a more holistic, robust, and transformative vision for urban ministry today. If we just lump them together, we miss the strategic genius.
All right, give us the operational breakdown then. If the society is the brain, the headquarters, what does the mission become?
So the society has that broad coordinating role. Its focus is macro, pulling together information, allocating funds, strategic planning, establishing diverse citywide ministries. It represented the broader domain of activities needed for a really comprehensive response.
Like the big umbrella.
Exactly. Think of the London City Mission Society or the New York City Mission Society. They were the umbrella organizations providing that stable financial and directional framework.
So they were the ones identifying the vacuum, like, maybe there's a need for specialized literacy programs for kids, and then creating the structure to fill it. And the individual mission was the filling itself.
Precisely. The individual mission that often grew out of the society, that was tactical. That was the street-level operating unit.
Boots on the ground.
Boots on the ground. It was typically defined by a very specific service-oriented role, focused on a single need, like running a Sabbath school or a particular lodging house, maybe a specialized chapel for a specific community.
Gotcha.
So, for example, the New York City Mission Sabbath School, organized in 1836, that was a distinct tactical unit. It operated under the strategy and, importantly, the funding of the much larger society. They were the shock troops, you could say, executing the plan.
That really clarifies the division of labor. The society keeps the war effort going, strategy, funding, and the mission wins the small, vital battles, block by block.
Okay, let's look at some real-world examples from America. How did this coordination play out practically in that early period, say, before 1865?
We've got some really good data from the New York City Mission Society that shows their early tactical choices. They focused very heavily on mass distribution of Christian literature, tracts, Bibles.
Literature as a primary tactic.
As a primary means of outreach, yeah. This wasn't just incidental. It was a deliberate strategy to penetrate these dense urban areas quickly especially where direct personal visits might be difficult or even dangerous at first.
And the logistics of that. I mean, the scale required to pull off that kind of literary penetration, it must have been impressive for the time. This wasn't just a few volunteers handing out pamphlets at a church fair. Oh, not at all. Think industrial scale evangelism. The sources show that between 1848 and 1850, the New York Society was annually distributing a truly staggering volume, somewhere between 1.3 million and 1.7 million tracts per year.
Wow.
That required immense coordination, significant cash, and a vast distribution network. They saw the printed word as essential infrastructure. Just like building a home or a school was infrastructure, so was getting these tracts out.
That kind of volume, it must have required more than just volunteers, right? Was there a reliance on paid, systematic staff right from the start? Does that signal a kind of professionalization of charity work?
Yes, and pretty quickly, too. While volunteers, these zealous tract visitors were definitely the lifeblood, the need for systematic coverage reaching everyone quickly led to employment.
Okay.
So by 1852, we see evidence of one woman being employed full-time specifically for systematic visitation among the poor. That number grew to 4 regularly employed women by 1856.
So it's moving towards the...
It demonstrates that transition from purely spontaneous fervor, maybe, to a planned salaried staff dedicated to disciplined, ongoing engagement.
And I find the funding insight about this literature drive particularly telling. It really shows their priorities, doesn't it? The sources mention the crucial role of the female branch in keeping this going.
Yeah, that detail really underscores their core focus at the time. The female branch initially contributed solely to paying the bills for the tracts used in distribution.
Solely for the paper and printing.
Think about that. Their priority wasn't necessarily immediate material relief, but mass communication of the gospel message via these tracts. It wasn't until later, 1863, that the female branch resolved to direct their funding specifically towards supporting the missionaries themselves, the people doing the visiting.
So the message came first.
This pattern, prioritizing the spiritual vehicle, the tract, before the human vehicle, the missionary's salary, it shows just how central the printed gospel was to the society's early strategic mission.
So the society model let them scale up, coordinate huge fundraising, implement specific, measurable things like distributing millions of tracts. But this was all just the means to a much bigger end, right? The ultimate goal wasn't just evangelism, it was transforming the whole civic and moral landscape of the city.
Exactly. And that brings us into the core philosophy, the really comprehensive strategy that defined this first wave. This wasn't simple charity work. It was a sophisticated attempt to engineer a complete solution to urban decay, creating what we're calling the prototype of the social safety net, built on some really deep theological and social principles.
And the most influential theoretical architect here seems to be Thomas Chalmers in Glasgow, his parish, St. John's. It sounds less like a church and more like a world-famous laboratory for applied Christian economics.
It truly was. Chalmers developed this highly structured system he called Christian and civic economy. His most fundamental and maybe world-shaping idea was the principle of locality.
Locality, meaning?
He believed that the sprawling, impersonal nature of the big city was basically a breeding ground for dependency and moral decay.
Okay.
So, to cure poverty and spiritual emptiness effectively, you had to break the city down into small, manageable districts, like going back to the intimacy of a country parish almost, small enough areas where personal relationships could be built.
That sounds radically different from the sort of impersonal mass charity model that might have been common then. Why insist on localized personal relationships over, say, large, centralized relief depots?
Because the aim for Chalmers was fundamentally moral and spiritual before it was material. The goal was what he called discerning personal charity, focused specifically on the moral and spiritual transformation of the individual. That, he believed, was the only permanent cure for poverty.
Discerning, meaning they judged.
Well, they investigated. Chalmers was fierce in opposing indiscriminate giving, and especially the legal provision of pauper relief, like early welfare. He saw it as morally corrosive. His method in St. John's was radical. He eliminated all legal parish relief entirely and replaced it completely with charity managed by a system of voluntary deacons who knew the families personally. They administered help only where moral failure was not seen as the primary cause.
So he was basically demanding moral rehabilitation as a kind of prerequisite for material aid. and he thought this produced better civic results.
Absolutely. He wasn't just trying to save souls. He claimed he was reforming citizenship itself. Chalmers believed this localized, morally focused approach would produce, in his words, a more erect and honorable and high-minded population, a people less able or willing to tolerate dependence or, well, profligacy. He saw pauperism not just as a lack of stuff, but as a failure of character and community responsibility.
He makes this explicit, quite powerful claim that abolishing pauperism, or at least the state version of it, would lead directly to tangible social improvement.
He did. He argued straight up that removing the safety net of indiscriminate giving would lead to an instantaneous growth of sobriety. And a reduction in profligacy, especially, he noted, among women. How? By strengthening the social stigma against vice. So, social pressure. He argued that by abolishing legal provision, you actually engaged the selfishness of parents on the side of the purity of their own offspring. A bit harsh sounding to us, maybe?
Yeah.
But in his view, legal relief thwarted the moral designs of nature. It annulled the sanctions that guard virtue and independence.
It's a profound, definitely challenging philosophy, viewing dependency itself as a kind of moral vice, potentially fostered by careless charity. Okay, so while Chalmers gave us this intense, local, almost surgical model for urban ministry, who provided the complementary macro-level vision, the one needed for, say, national mobilization.
Right, you need both. That global macro-level societal vision that really came from Johann Hinrich Wichern in Germany. He championed the inner mission. This was Wichern's response to the massive poverty, the political turmoil, the spiritual godlessness he saw plaguing 19th century Germany. He called for a comprehensive, coordinated national network of Christian social work.
The vision sounds huge. Nothing less than the re-Christianization of the German people. That's colossal ambition.
It was. And it was an ambitious, coordinated structural response, mirroring the society model. The Central Committee for the Intermission, formed in 1849, was set up specifically to coordinate vast activities across the whole nation.
Oh.
Their explicit structure was designed to relieve social needs that weren't currently being met by the family, the existing church, or the state, with the ultimate goal of leading those won through social service back into the church body itself.
And what's key to understanding Wichern, it seems, is how he saw himself, or saw the mission. The sources suggest he viewed the intermission as an essential counterforce, a counter to secularization, maybe, and to institutional impotence.
Precisely. Wichern didn't pull any punches. He saw his movement standing up amid the extraordinary and distorted conditions of the present, before which those in authority are impotent and the church is silent.
Strong words?
Very. The mission for him was to restore the indestructible unity of life in state and church, in the nation and family. He saw that unity as fractured by industrialism, by secular thought, and this ambition, this huge goal of restoring the unity of life that explains the astonishing breadth of early activities that characterized this whole first wave.
This really was a prototype of a comprehensive social safety net then, covering ground far, far beyond what we think of as a city mission today. Let's spend some time detailing that breadth of activity, again, focusing pre-1865.
Okay. Well, we see rapid expansion across really diverse domains. Starting with publication and education, again, that reliance on mass distribution was just monumental. In Germany alone, between 1812 and 1830, 31 different Bible societies were founded.
21.
Yeah, alongside 5 dedicated tract societies set up between 1811 and 1833. And they engaged major commercial publishing houses, names like Keffer, Hohnmeyer, Perthes, to produce gospel-focused literature. They knew the printed word was the necessary first step before physical visitation could even happen effectively.
So, masters of logistics, mass media for their era. Beyond publishing, what did the direct social services look like, particularly in something like child welfare?
Child welfare was absolutely critical. Wichern's work is the prime example here. His child-saving initiative, especially at the famous Rauhes House, the Rough House, near Hamburg.
The Rough House.
Yeah, it pioneered concepts we'd recognize as modern juvenile reform. He championed 2 key principles, change of environment and the family system.
How did this family system actually work at the Rauhes House?
It was pretty radical for institutional care back then. Instead of warehousing delinquent or neglected boys in big impersonal barracks,
Which was common.
very common, Wichern divided them into small, manageable groups, 10 or 12 boys per group. Each group lived in its own separate small house, trying to approximate a real family unit. Now, the system created a need. It necessitated the creation and the systematic training of dedicated, non-parental caregivers. He called them house fathers.
House father.
Yeah. They provided moral guidance, vocational training, spiritual instruction, all within this more home-like setting. And this model, it became hugely influential across Europe and even in the U.S.
And that focus on family structure and moral environment, did it extend to protecting other vulnerable groups?
Well, yeah.
Young working women?
Yes, absolutely. For example, they identified the need for safe, supervised housing for young women who were moving to the cities for factory work, a huge issue.
Right.
So the society stepped in. The first dedicated home established for factory girls providing a well-conducted place to live with religious instruction was set up by Karl Mez in Freiburg-Baden way back in 1845. They recognized that protecting vulnerable women from the moral dangers of the city was an essential preventative measure against poverty later on.
So they're pioneering modern concepts in education, juvenile justice, workforce housing for women, all under this umbrella of re-Christianizing society. This must have required some pretty sophisticated analysis of why people were falling into poverty in the first place. The American groups, like the New York AICP, developed a really detailed sociological analysis, didn't they?
They did. The New York AICP, that's the Association for Improving the Condition of the Poor, was maybe the quintessential American expression of this very discerning approach. Their publications included this remarkably sophisticated list, 10 causes of pauperism.
10 causes. What were they?
Well, they addressed the obvious moral failures, ignorance, idleness, intemperance, drunkenness was huge. But they also included systemic traps, things that preyed on the poor. They identified factors like lotteries, pawnbrokers, brothels, gambling houses.
Let's look closer at that list because it really shows their multifaceted thinking. Beyond the obvious moral causes, what other systemic traps did they identify? It wasn't just about individual behavior.
Right. The AICP also included things like lavish funerals. They saw the cultural pressure to spend extravagantly on burials as a financial trap, potentially making the survivors destitute.
Interesting.
They also criticized improvident marriages, basically, marrying without the means to actually support a family. They saw that as both a financial and a moral failure. They viewed these things not just as bad luck, but as areas where organized charity needed to intervene through education, through moral suasion, to try and prevent the cycle of poverty.
So, addressing both individual character and these corrosive systems at the same time.
Exactly.
The 10th cause, that one is the most controversial, maybe the most defining statement of their whole philosophy. It connects right back to Chalmers, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The 10th cause they listed was charities that gave away money too freely.
Wow. Okay.
This just reveals their deep, almost fierce emphasis on careful stewardship, personal investigation, and discerning charity. They saw indiscriminate charity, just running soup houses without strict investigation, as morally and materially destructive. Their foundational belief was that just giving, without requiring some kind of change or effort, it fostered dependence. It led to the creation of what they actually termed pauperized humanity.
It really sounds like they were deeply suspicious of anything that looked like a permanent handout or subsidy. Given this skepticism towards indiscriminate giving, how did the societies actually handle cases of genuine inability like sickness versus what they saw as moral failure? Or were they just criticized for being too harsh?
That was the constant tightrope they walked. Their model, remember, rooted in that principle of locality. It relied on the deacon or the visitor knowing the family personally, really knowing them, enough to distinguish between poverty caused by, say, illness or some uncontrollable circumstance where material aid was seen as appropriate and poverty they believed was caused by vice.
And in that case?
In that case, the intervention was primarily moral instruction, behavioral correction, often coupled with things like enforced temperance pledges. And yes, they were frequently criticized, called paternalistic, intrusive.
I can imagine.
But their response was always that only this personal discerning approach could lead to the ultimate goal, self-respect and self-support, which they saw as the absolute prerequisite for a genuine Christian life.
This intense categorization, this discernment, we see it in the activities of related organizations too.
Oh, yeah. The Children's Aid Society, for instance, they practiced categorization rigorously. They're famous, or maybe infamous, for their orphan trains.
Right.
Placing thousands of children, the numbers are huge, between 1,000 and 4,000 annually in the mid-19th century with families out in the country. This was a radical rejection of large-scale, subsidized, urban institutional care for kids.
Why?
They were placing children specifically to break what they saw as the environmental dependency of the city. They believed that just indiscriminately subsidizing a child's life in the slums, well, it created more problems than it solved in the long run.
The sheer breadth is just astounding. Publishing houses, juvenile justice reform, sociological analysis, training professional caregivers. But if they created such a comprehensive parallel social infrastructure, why did this society model, in its broadest sense, eventually seem to shrink? Why did it specialize? What happened?
Well, the societies, by intentionally taking on such an incredibly broad domain of activities, they essentially created this parallel social infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
Covering everything from literacy and housing to preventative health and even basic income support in some ways.
Yeah.
That sheer breadth, it became fundamentally unsustainable over the long haul, particularly once a major competitor emerged. A competitor that had virtually limitless scope and crucially guaranteed funding mechanisms that church-based organizations could just never match.
And you're talking about the gradual but inevitable rise of the modern formal welfare state,
Sure.
which started adopting many of these functions but often stripped them of their original theological mandate.
Exactly. As the 19th century rolled into the 20th, many of the social functions that were established, even innovated by these societies, things like child protection, general relief for the poor, public health initiatives, standardized education, they were gradually displaced, taken over, formalized by government programs.
So the government adopted the functions.
Yes, but often systematically rejected the underlying philosophy, especially that foundational emphasis on individual moral transformation and, required reciprocity.
It's interesting because the early organizations like the AICP, they were already signaling the technical need for careful investigation, for categorization, things later social workers would formalize.
Yeah.
But without that moral check, the whole character of the service just changed, didn't it?
It really did. The societies were fundamentally focused on affiliation, on belonging, and on moral change. By the mid-20th century, though, particularly after the big cultural shifts of the 1960s, the focus shifted dramatically. Well, driven partly by increasing prosperity, but also changing social views, the system moved much more towards entitlement over investigation, towards depersonalization, really, over that personal bond Chalmers insisted on. Where the city mission societies demanded independence and moral transformation, later governmental systems often viewed any kind of moral categorization or character assessment as inherently judgmental, or maybe just a cheap way to fight poverty without spending real money.
That sounds like the ultimate inversion of Chalmers' whole philosophy. He argued indiscriminate giving was destructive because it destroyed character.
Right.
And the modern state often saw any attempt to assess character as destructive to human dignity.
That's the core conflict, isn't it? The societies existed to restore Wichern's idea of that indestructible unity of life, merging faith and social responsibility. The specialized state, however, systematically separates them. So consequently, if the government gradually took over child welfare, literacy programs, general public health, basic income relief, what was left for the original city mission movement to focus on? What actually endured?
The sources seem pretty clear there was a definite specialization, driven by where the state either could not or maybe would not effectively step in.
Precisely. What endured, what became the specialized, lasting definition of the modern city mission movement that we recognize today was the focus on the most difficult needs. Those needs that seem to require fundamental moral and spiritual intervention. Chronic homelessness and addiction.
Okay.
These were the areas where the state's purely material solutions often proved inadequate, and where that original moral transformation model, the foundational principle of the city mission societies, was still seen as demonstrably required.
So the specialization wasn't really a failure of the city mission societies, maybe, but more like a strategic retreat, of focusing onto the high ground where their original methodology, spiritual change first, was still necessary and, they believed, effective.
I think that's exactly right. The modern mission retained those foundational methods because they believed and still believe that only a profound change of heart could lead to permanent self-sufficiency for people dealing with long-term addiction and homelessness.
Okay.
So the confirmed activities in this enduring legacy include things like the continuation of house-to-house visitation. That foundational method of building personal relationships, championed by Chalmers.
Still essential.
Still essential. Evangelism in specific often closed off industrial environments, factories, docks, pubs, public houses, taking the message to where people actually were.
And the relentless focus on what they termed gospel temperance meetings.
Yeah.
This emphasis on addiction recovery really became a defining feature, didn't it?
It became the defining specialization, arguably. The sources give specific data points showing what they saw as the effectiveness of this spiritual approach to addiction, missionaries being instrumental in leading, hopefully, hundreds of drunkards to be reformed in a single year through these temperance meetings.
Okay.
Whether it's through the early conversions recorded at the London City Mission or the establishment of specialized halfway houses later on, like Jerry Macaulay's Water Street Mission, the core belief remained absolute. Christ alone can save the bruised and crippled world, seeking to change hearts, not just the environment around them.
And that message, it remains powerfully stated by the organizations that carry on this legacy today. The London City Mission, for example, explicitly states they believe the real dynamic to lift the world, to bring people in touch with Christ, is the old-fashioned gospel of divine grace.
Yeah.
And that there's simply nothing to take its place.
That conviction right there, that's the enduring legacy of the societies. They recognize very early on that while material need could be temporarily eased by money, only a spiritual transformation rooted in character could produce the self-respect and self-support they demanded of citizens. They saw dependency, whether it was material dependency or chemical dependency, as a form of slavery, maybe with a smiling mask sometimes, but slavery nonetheless. And that willingness to blend robust social action with uncompromising moral expectation, that's what made them such a powerful and, frankly, radical force of innovation back in the 19th century.
So wrapping this up, what does this all mean for us today? Looking back at this first wave, it was clearly far more than just simple charity work. It was this complex, unified strategy embodied in the structure of the society itself, designed to completely redefine the relationship between faith, poverty, and urban life.
Yeah.
It was less like a scattering of individual soup kitchens and far more like a centralized strategic headquarters, designed to integrate the whole of life, moral, physical, spiritual, for the city dweller.
It was really a monumental achievement in social engineering, but guided by this fervent piety. They pioneered a truly radical model of multi-front efforts, focusing strategically on why people were poor, tackling both the environment and the individual character, while fighting tooth and nail against the temptation of indiscriminate giving, which they genuinely saw as morally and materially destructive.
They were the innovators.
They were the innovators who built that first expansive, coordinated social safety net, one that dared to demand internal change as the necessary path to true external independence.
It's powerful to look back at the scope of Wichern's vision, too, which really informed the whole movement. The city mission societies saw themselves as essential counterforces to secularization, didn't they? Building this vast social safety net because they felt the government and the existing church structures were either impotent or just silent in the face of all this urban decay. So if the goal of the societies, according to Wichern, was to restore that indestructible unity of life in state and church, in the nation and family, well, the question for us today seems profoundly relevant. What essential societal needs are currently unmet by those three pillars? The government, the family, and the established church. Where are the gaps now? And what might require the innovation and coordination of some kind of new society to step in?
That's the question, isn't it?
That question of where the gaps lie today and how we might organize ourselves to fill them, that feels like something truly worth exploring.